and make sure you sign the attendance sheet over there. Today, following the widely promoted visit that President Trump made to India last week, and since we haven't had a chance to look so much at that country lately, I thought it would be interesting to take a look at what's going on there and the state of the relationship between India and the United States. But before we look at India, there are a couple of developments which have occurred over the past week. A bit of a follow-up on what we have seen earlier in our earlier classes. The first one is the Israeli parliamentary elections today as we speak. Nothing has changed there. It's the third election in 11 months. And the predictions, unfortunately for the Israeli voters, indicate that, please turn your cell phone off, thank you. Seem to indicate that the outcome will be pretty much the same, basically paralyzing the normal functioning of the state, since with a caretaker government in place now for over a year, no budget can be voted, thus no new program or project can be launched and implemented because of the lack of funds, since there is no money. Not to mention that not even new laws can be voted. In addition, neither the incumbent, the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, under indictment for fraud and corruption, and whose trial should open on March 17, actually, has been willing to form a coalition with his main rival, Benny Gantz, who himself has been unwilling to be part of a government whose prime minister is under indictment. So, since both parties are also unable at this time to form a coalition with smaller parties in order to reach the required 61 seats in the Knesset, in the Israeli parliament, which has 120 seats, there is a real possibility that in the absence of a clear winner, there will be a fourth round of elections sometime later in the spring or this summer. Needless to say that calls for a reform of the electoral system in Israel have got stronger, has grown stronger. They denounce the current system, which encourages this political fragmentation in Israel, since there is a very low threshold, if you remember, around 3.5%, on parties to be represented in the parliament. Therefore, there are a dozen parties represented there, and they have a hard time forming a coalition this time. Ironically, though, The only party that might come out ahead in this election, like the last time, was the Arab Israeli Party, called Joint List, which for the first time ever in the last election presented a joint list and got some 12 seats in the parliament, which is about, it's 12% of the seats. So it's significant. We'll see what happens later today. The second development that you might have seen in the press, in the media, was the signing on Saturday, which we mentioned as a possibility last week, because we are visionaries here, of this Taliban-American agreement in Doha, Qatar, which opens the way for a gradual withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan over time, which is contingent, however, of the commitment of the Taliban to open peace negotiations with the Afghan government in Kabul, and to a commitment to the United States to make sure that no terrorist attacks, like the one on 9/11, will be planned on Afghan soil and on the American troops stationed still and NATO allies, because there are some 3,000, something like that, NATO soldiers still in Afghanistan, and from other countries, actually, not only from NATO, but other countries also in Afghanistan. So that no military attacks or terrorist attacks will be conducted against those troops. Well, that remains very much to be seen, because, again, as I mentioned, since we saw Afghanistan last week, the hard part only starts now, when the negotiation between the Afghan government and the Taliban will open, which should lead actually to first a ceasefire, and then trying to figure out what type of government, what form of government will rule Afghanistan after the ceasefire. So peace is not guaranteed by any stretch of imagination, but the mere signature of such a deal is undoubtedly an historic event, since it might mark the end of the longest war in the American history. Speaking of difficulties, already the deal came into resistance from the Afghan government, because the deal calls for the freeing of some 5,000 Taliban. There are around 15,000 Taliban prisoners in the Afghan jails, taken prisoners by the troops, the Kabul government troops. And 5,000 of them, at least that's what the deal seems to be saying, should be released by the Afghan government. But the Afghan government said yesterday already that they don't agree with this provision, since they were not part of this agreement between the United States and the Taliban. They were not consulted, and that the Afghan people should be consulted first before letting these Taliban prisoners go. That's where we're standing today. There seems to be some of deliberate or not confusion about the freeing of this, the release of these 5,000 Taliban. The Taliban are saying themselves that they will not sit down at the negotiating table with the Afghan government unless these 5,000 prisoners are released. So we'll see. And finally, and probably one of the most serious crises over last week was the sudden escalation of tension between Turkey and Russia in Syria. In a way, this crisis flew under the radar with all this coronavirus issue that obviously took central place over last week. Now, the crisis revolves around the city of Idlib on the border with Turkey, a Syrian city on the border with Turkey. Why is it? You might remember when we looked at Syria the last time, is that Idlib is the last stronghold of the insurgents against the government of Bashar al-Assad in Damascus. Not only it's the last stronghold militarily, but also it hosts some 2.5 million Syrian refugees who went there to get protection from the fighting which is taking place in other parts of Syria. And as you can tell, for them, there is no other place to go. This is the last stop before who knows what. So, in a way, Idlib came to symbolize, if you will, the various and opposing interests of the main actors in the conflict. For instance, Syria's President al-Assad is eager to retake control of the entirety of his country and to destroy, since he's backed by Russia, to destroy the last pockets of resistance there. For its part, Russia, which is supporting Assad as its most valuable strategic ally in the region, is eager nonetheless to put an end to this grinding conflict and the involvement of its soldiers in Syria, which is increasingly unpopular in Russia because of the high number of human casualties and also the high cost of this involvement. And Turkey, which got involved in Syria, as you may remember, in the first place to fight the Kurds, on the other side of the country, in the eastern part of Turkey, Syria, the Turkish-Syrian border, is absolutely unwilling to take more Syrian refugees. It has already something like 3 million from all the fighting that has been taking place in Syria for the past 9 years. And is totally unwilling to take on more Syrian refugees from Idlib. And thus has sent troops to Idlib to bolster the insurgents against al-Assad. So you have now Syria, Russia on one side, Russia and Syria, the government of Syria on one side, and Turkey on the other. The US is not involved. Now, last Thursday, the incident that everybody was dreading happened. During a air and artillery strike by Syrian forces, government forces, backed by Russia, about 35 Turkish soldiers were killed and many more injured. Needless to say that the tension rose immediately with Turkish President Erdogan threatening retaliation. As a matter of fact, his troops now are attacking the Syrians. He hasn't said anything about the Russians, except that he might go to Moscow to meet with Putin this coming week at some point. But also what happened on the diplomatic front, that the NATO member states met in an emergency session in Brussels. Let's not forget that Turkey is a member of NATO. The United Nations Security Council met in an emergency session here in the city, and that European Union issued a statement urging restraint. Now, this very lukewarm support from the European Union only incensed Erdogan, who threatened to open his border right there with Greece, and to let all the refugees, first of all, to open its borders with Syria, and let all the Syrian refugees who are in Idlib at this time come to this country, only to ship them or to bus them to the Greek border, which is a member of the European Union. Now, you can imagine for the European Union, which is in the middle of just opening very difficult trade negotiations with the UK on Brexit, sometimes later this week. That's all they needed. They could not agree on the refugees they have already in their midst since 2015. There hasn't been any solution so far as to what to do with them. And here there is a threat of receiving millions or hundreds of thousands more refugees from Turkey. Also, let's not forget that up to now, Turkey and the EU had an agreement whereby the Turks would not let Syrian or Afghan or other refugees coming from Arab countries to go into Greece or any other place in the European Union in exchange for money that the European Union was giving to the Turkish president, to Erdogan. So Erdogan has made this type of threat before. This is not the first time. But this time he seems to mean business, because according to the latest reports, some 100,000 Syrian refugees were bused to the border with Greece, and Greece deployed a number of troops on its own border and to stop any stream of refugees coming on its soil. So that's where we're standing now. For the Europeans, it's another headache that they did not need it at this time, and it remains to be seen how the Russians and the Turks will work out their differences. Probably they'll find a diplomatic solution, because obviously neither country is ready to go to war over that. Putin has his own domestic problems, and Erdogan cannot take on Russia militarily by itself. So, and the NATO countries, needless to say, are not ready to go to war with Russia over Turkey and Syria. So, a diplomatic solution has to be found somehow. Nonetheless, the threat of a new flux of refugees into the European Union is real. So we'll see there as well. And now let's go back to India. It's not too far, actually. By all accounts, I knew it. That was pure luck. By all accounts, the two-day visit that President Trump made to India was a smashing success, as all the ingredients that the American president considers to make a great event were assembled. Large crowds, spectacular display of showmanship, and even a few trade deals, although the expected major trade deal, which was supposed to be signed, did not materialize. Nonetheless, for both leaders, this visit was a welcome reprieve. For Donald Trump, who's hugely popular in India, where he's seen as a strong leader, pro-business, and tough on terrorism, the trip represented a definite change of subject and scenery. After the impeachment trial and all the issues, domestic issues that keep challenging his presidency back home. And for his host, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, it was a temporary break from the mass protests generated by the recent passing of two laws in the Indian parliament. The two bills, we're going to see them a little later, that have fueled tensions not only between the Hindu majority and the Muslim minority in India, but also between India and its neighbor, Pakistan. In fact, this protest continued even during President Trump's visit to New Delhi, and have caused losses of life and significant material damage. That being said, Modi is a popular figure in India, a populist and a nationalist who won by a landslide last May a second 5-year term as Prime Minister. With his party, the Hindu nationalist Bharatiya Janata Party, or the BJP, getting close to 350 seats in the 543 seats of the lower house of parliament. India has a bicameral legislature. They have an upper house where the delegates are elected by each of the 29 states that form the Union, the Federation of India, and the lower house where the lawmakers are elected by election, normal elections, direct elections. Modi is the first prime minister in 50 years to win majorities in the parliament in back-to-back elections, and now commands a sweeping mandate to rule this country of 1.3 billion. Paradoxically, these demonstrations, which took place in Delhi and in other countries across India, are in a way the price to pay for his popularity, and let me explain why. Modi comes from a modest background, from the city of Ahmedabad, which is somewhere here, in the state of Gujarat. City actually that President Trump visited first, where he landed when he arrived in India last week. Very early, Modi joined the BJP, the Nationalist Party, and in his 20s and 30s worked for that party, overseeing the printing of pamphlets promoting Hindutva. Hindutva is the belief in the primacy of the Hindu religion and way of life. Rising through the ranks, Modi became chief minister of his home state, Gujarat, and came to national attention for the first time in 2002, when Gujarat exploded in religious riots, directed mostly against Muslims. Modi was blamed for looking the other way, and those riots caused around 1,000 dead, most of them Muslims. From then on, he would be considered as a hero by the Indian right and a murderer among many Muslims. Soon after the riots, though, Modi sought to cultivate a different reputation, becoming a friend of free enterprise and helping attract thousands of manufacturing jobs to his home state. business people and middle-class voters rallied around him, seeing him with someone who was efficient and could get things done. While his reputation as an efficient manager expanded well beyond the borders of his home state, the reputation of the Indian National Congress, party which had ruled India for better part of the 70 years of independence, was plagued by scandals and the absence of an inspiring leader. As a combination of Hindu nationalism, support of the business community, and the decaying state of India's largest political party, proved to be the winning ticket for Modi, who became Prime Minister of India in 2014, the first time actually that he ran for office. Once in power, he swiftly consolidated his authority, approving Hindu nationalists to key posts, changing place names from Muslim to Hindu, and rewriting children books by purging sections on Muslim rulers in India. And the 2014 elections were just a preview of things to come. Despite mixed economic results of his first term, some of them were popular, like installing 100 million toilets in the rural areas and delivering tanks of cooking gas to almost every home. Other promises went unfulfilled, particularly creating enough jobs in the agricultural sector, which still occupies almost half the Indian population. That's 700 million people almost. Modi's re-election last year, it's a 5-year term, so he got elected in 2014 and re-elected last year, was even more triumphant than the first one. Why is that? Basically, because he came across to the some 900 million Indian voters as a leader willing to go to any lengths to secure the strength and security of his country. That was evidenced by an incident that took place last year, just before, a couple of months before the elections, when a suicide bombing claimed by a group based in Pakistan, suicide bombing that took place in the disputed region of Kashmir, killed dozens of Indian soldiers. Modi sent fighter jets to conduct airstrikes within Pakistan, and this belligerent position, combined with positive coverage by the Indian media, burnished his image as among Indian voters. And this aura of invincibility enabled him to make recently these two far-reaching decisions that I mentioned earlier, which might have serious consequences both internally, domestically, and internationally. The first one of these two decisions was the abrogation last August of Article 370 of the Indian Constitution. What is Article 370? Basically, it is a provision that granted a special status to the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir, allowing it to have its own constitution, its own flag, to make state laws and decisions except for matters related to foreign policy and defense. That special status granted to Jammu and Kashmir, this is basically the area, which was described as temporary, was included in the Indian Constitution in 1949. Why did this state enjoy a special status? Well, let's have a little bit of history here. Following the 1947 partition between India and Pakistan, the two countries went to war, claiming authority over the entire region of Kashmir. The entire region of Kashmir is this. What was Kashmir before? Basically, it was a princely state ruled by an Indian Maharaja, but with a Muslim majority population. About 77% of the population of Kashmir is Muslim. Now, following the ceasefire after the war between India and the newly established India and Pakistan, the United Nations established boundaries between the two combatants, the so-called line of control. India took over roughly 55% of the land and 70% of its population, and created the state of Jammu and Kashmir, as it was known all this time, while Pakistan took control of approximately 30% of the land. India's Kashmir, Pakistan's Kashmir. And the remaining 15% of the land went to the People's Republic of China, right here. But we're not going to involve China in this. It's not relevant for our for today. Even though China and India went to war over even this part of Kashmir back in 1962, a very short war, but they still went to war, because China has also claims over other parts of Kashmir. But we leave it out today. It's complex enough as it is. However, these boundaries, even these boundaries set up by the United Nations, have been constantly contested by both countries, who went to war 3 more times over this area, in 1965, in 71, and in 1999. In light of that situation, particular situation of Jammu and Kashmir, with a population which was in majority Muslim, the Indian Parliament adopted Article 370, granting it a special status. Now, despite this partition, various Muslim grassroots movements supported by successive Pakistani governments continued to demand self-determination. And their movements grew stronger as the Indian political repression intensified. Infiltration by Muslim terrorist groups fomenting unrest and carrying out attacks on Indian soldiers stationed there multiplied. By abrogating Article 370, the BJP effectively quashed any hope for any Kashmiri hope for self-determination and drew Kashmir closer to India, reducing it from a state. It is no longer a state since last August. It became 2 union territories, which is less than a state, and those territories are now ruled not by a local government as it was previously, but directly by New Delhi, by the central government. In addition, anticipating outrage and protest, the Indian government placed the Kashmir Valley right here, where the majority of the Muslim population lives, under lockdown, arresting local politicians, cutting off communications with the outside world, and flooding Kashmir with Indian troops. And while some of these extreme measures have been lifted since last August, many Kashmiri political leaders are still in jail today, and the Indian military presence there is overwhelming. The decision to abrogate Article 370 is not surprising per se, since Modi's ruling party has long harbored the desire to complete Kashmir's total integration into the rest of India. Modi's popularity and the lack of an effective ideological resistance was evidenced by the second decision made by the Indian Parliament, which was the adoption of the Citizen Amendment Act. What is the Citizen Amendment Act? Simply put, it's a law that provides fast track to Indian citizenship to members of minority groups, Hindu, Sikhs, Buddhists, Christians, from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, all Muslim states, who came to India illegally. However, no mention is made of Muslim refugees. To justify its decision, the Indian government insists that these religious minorities, which I just mentioned, from Muslim countries, are at risk in those countries, are persecuted, and they are unlikely to find refuge elsewhere. However, the Indian government does not say is that there are other Muslim groups which are persecuted in Muslim countries. For instance, there are 5 million Ahmadis in Pakistan who are not considered by the Sunni Muslims, as Muslim because they do not believe that Muhammad was the final prophet. And also because only Muslim majority countries have been named in this law. When you have countries like Myanmar, neighboring Myanmar, which is a Buddhist country and which has a large Muslim majority of Rohingyas, of whom you heard, and who are not named at all. So the Muslims from Rohingya have absolutely no right to Indian citizenship if they ever came to settle in India. In addition, the Indian Parliament voted the establishment of a national register of citizenship, which is sort of nationwide catalog of the legal status of all individuals in India. While obviously every country has a right to draft a register of citizens, the way of determining who is a citizen in a country where many poor Indians lack identifying documents is problematic. Now, let's suppose that two individuals, one Muslim and one Hindu, were asked to prove their claims to citizenship. And let's suppose for a moment that the officials determine that both are in India illegally. After the enactment of the citizen law, the Hindu will have a fast track to naturalization, while the Muslim will not, because he comes from a Muslim country. So in the eyes of the Indian authorities, he's illegally in India and should be going back to the country from which he comes from, because on paper anyway, he's not persecuted. Through this simple provision, and for the first time since India's constitution was adopted in 1949, Parliament explicitly linked religious identity to citizenship. A little bit of background here, too. After the 1947 partition, the British created two independent states, Pakistan as a homeland for the subcontinent's Muslims, and India as a secular and pluralist country, with a majority of Hindus, but also with the second largest population of Muslims in the world, some 220 million. It has never defined India's identity in terms of religion or ethnicity. That explains why this citizenship law has provoked unprecedented resistance across the country, and why many state governments have pledged not to implement it in the future. So this is a turbulent environment that President Trump discovered last week. Yet these issues went obviously unmentioned during his visit. Further evidence that the two leaders have developed what they consider a mutually advantageous partnership that should not be jeopardized. That was not always the case, as only 3 years ago, US-Indian relations seemed destined to falter Trump's America's First agenda, which asks what every American ally has done for the US lately, clashed directly with India's expectation that it would continue to benefit from American generosity, particularly in the form of diplomatic support and technology access. Yet 3 years into Trump's presidency, the partnership with India has not only survived, but flourished. Modi's success in keeping the US's attention has a lot to do with both countries concerned over China's ascent. Indeed, Washington and New Delhi are trying very hard to keep Asia's continental and maritime spaces free from Chinese domination and resist China's encroachment on the sovereignty, security, and economic activities of states in the region. Since taking office, Trump has authorized the release of several advanced US weapon systems to India. That being said, and despite this cordial personal relationship developed between the two leaders, the truth is that India and the US are far from being allies, as evidenced in the many delays in reaching a settlement on this trade dispute. For instance, India has imposed retaliatory duties on US agricultural products and metals in response to US tariffs on Indian steel and aluminum, and resists the lifting of tariffs on US manufactured goods, tariffs stemming from India's desire to protect its economy from foreign competition. Other major points of contention exist between the two countries. Iran is one of them. India, which strongly supported the 2015 Iranian nuclear deal, has tried very hard ever since Washington withdrew from this nuclear deal, to drastically reduce its oil imports from Iran, despite its heavy reliance on Iranian oil and the land access that Iran offered India, access to Afghanistan, circumventing Pakistan. However, that's as far as India would go, since New Delhi resisted many times the US repeated calls to side with Washington in its confrontation with Iran. Relations with Russia is another point of contention. As India is determined to protect its ties with Moscow. In 2018, for instance, India announced the purchase of an air defense system from Russia, very similar to the one that Turkey bought from Russia as well. And the two countries reaffirmed their military partnership. Washington has asked many times New Delhi to reconsider it, but India has not budged. So how can we define the nature of the current US-Indian relationship? beyond the good chemistry existing between the two men. Can it be called an alliance? Well, probably not. It's more like a partnership of convenience between the two countries. But according to reports, the president had a great time. He attended, well, he was there for 2 days, so it's not. But according to reports also, he found that the trip was worth 8,000 miles to go there and 8,000 miles to come back, which is more than commuting, really. All right, so let's take a break and come back with your questions, including the one that I mentioned earlier on Syria and the elections in Israel. And yes. Thank you.
seems to want to limit China's influence and so forth. But long term, they've got a lot. You know, they ship a lot of stuff to a lot of different places, and if it starts affecting supply chains and so forth, how serious do you think that is long term for China?
You stole my thunder. The virus was supposed to be the last class next week.
I'm sure it'll be okay then too.
Just to really leave you on a sour note next week, you know, I was going to look at it, but not from, obviously not from a medical point of view, since first of all, that's not my domain, and number two, nobody knows. But mostly from a political and economic viewpoint, how this could happen in 2020. Needless to say, China has a major role in every way. Its population, which is huge, and nowadays with people who travel, but the questions which to which we don't have answers so far are how this is being transmitted. We don't know. How easy it is to get it, we don't know. If you had it once and you don't have it anymore, can you get it back again? We don't know. So it is very difficult. And what we don't know, partly it's because the scientists do not know themselves to some extent, and maybe they know things that they do not tell us. That's another issue, and that's another huge question. Trying not to generate panic and in the population, which, you know, it's not only the epidemic; it's a perception of epidemic, which is even probably stronger than the epidemic itself. I'm not downplaying the epidemic, but we don't know. So it will be very difficult to talk about something we don't know next week for 40 minutes, but I'll try. It's difficult to answer your question at this point, you know. China absolutely plays that much, everybody agrees on. But how did that get to China, or did that really start in China, or is it a man-made epidemic, or is it something that happened because, I don't know, the diet? We don't. All these questions have not been answered. Why do certain people get it and no others? Because all the measures that have been implemented up to now are sort of halfway measures. For instance, in France, this weekend, the government prohibited basketball games, just to give you an example, because they are being played in confined environment, in arenas. So they decided that basketball games attended by more than 5,000 people should be postponed. And how about 4,999, you know? Then you don't get it, which is totally idiotic as reasoning. What tells you that if you have 200 people, you don't get contaminated by the virus? Why has it to be 5,000? It's arbitrary. Sorry? And, you know, Italy is the same thing. They took this type of measures which are half-baked because, again, nobody has an answer to it. So obviously they want to prevent the epidemic from spreading, but at the same time they do not want people to panic. So it's a very fine line that officials and the authorities are walking.
Yeah, some of the officials talking about China have been blaming them for, keeping it quiet. I mean, and
Yes.
just not kind of relating to.
Well, that's
the
a
fact that
different
the
story.
Spanish
Yeah,
flu
well,
in
it's
1980
obviously it's being politicized, obviously. But here too, it's being politicized already. Instead of focusing on the epidemic and what can be done, it's being politicized. The administration has or has not done what it's supposed to be doing. But what are you supposed to be doing? That's a question. Yes.
I'd like to go back to Israel for a minute. And you had mentioned that there is a third party, an Arab-Israeli
Yes.
party. Are there implications there that if that party were to win an election, would it change the dynamics between Israel and Palestine?
You mean the Arab Party?
If you said there's a kind of a third Arab-Israeli party.
Well, I
yeah.
didn't say there is an Arab party called Joint List, but they cannot win the elections because you have 500,000 Arab Israelis, so they cannot win. They don't get enough votes, no matter out of 8 million people in Israel or 8.5 million, so they cannot win the elections.
But didn't you say there was a third party made up of both Arabs and Israelis?
No.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought.
I'm sorry, but then it wasn't clear. There are two main parties,
Okay.
the Likud and white and blue,
Right.
or blue and white.
And then the Arab is the third party.
And then you have the joint, no, there are other Israeli parties also. There are a dozen of them. I didn't mention the others, but the two major parties are Gantz's and Netanyahu's.
Right.
Then you have center-right, center-left, and so on. And you have Meretz, and you have the Labour Party, and then you have all type of number of religious, 4 or 5 religious parties. No, there is that is why it is so difficult to have a government. Up to now it could be done because Netanyahu had enough, and even then with Likud in power, his party for such a long time in power, even then his majority was very thin, 62, 63 seats in the parliament. And he was always subject to 1 or 2 of the other parties just defecting and going to the other side, in which case Israel had a minority government also. And with a vote of confidence or vote of non-confidence, the government could fall. So it is extremely difficult. So maybe after these elections, if they are decisive and we're not running into 4th or 5th or 6th elections, this particular election is extremely difficult because under normal circumstances, probably, I'm saying probably, Netanyahu and Gantz would have found some kind of arrangement, like 2 years as prime minister from Netanyahu, 2 years from Gantz. It was done before in Israel. They could work it out. But in this particular case, under these circumstances, with Netanyahu under indictment, this is a main pretext for Gantz to say, I want to be prime minister, because he cannot be prime minister any longer. Israel has never had a prime minister under indictment. So I don't want to be part of a government. That might be just a pretext, okay? But this is his leverage. I cannot be part of a government whose prime minister is under indictment. He should resign, or at least he should just be suspended from his function, go to trial, found guilty or innocent, and then if he's found innocent, okay, he comes back. If he's guilty, he goes to jail, like other prime ministers in Israel did, Olmert in particular. So, or president of Israel, it happened before. So that's the issue this time. Plus, you have a major player also, which is who up to now sided with Netanyahu. Up to the previous elections, sided with Netanyahu and was even his foreign minister for a long time, Avigdor Lieberman. He has a party. He doesn't have too many seats, but he joining one or other party would give the larger party probably a majority in the Knesset. But he doesn't want to join Netanyahu because Netanyahu just fired him when he was minister. So he's holding a personal grudge against Netanyahu. And he doesn't want to side with Gantz, because for Gantz to form a coalition, he might have to rely on the votes of this Arab list, even though he said many times, Gantz, that he will not accept Arab votes to become prime minister. Obviously in Israel, this would not be a very popular decision. So Lieberman, comes from who represents a nationalist party in Israel, doesn't want to be part of a coalition that includes Arabs in it. So that's the reason why he does not want to join Gantz's party. So he's in the middle. He's a kingmaker. And partly the issue depends on him. But so far, none of these three leaders has shown any flexibility. So, and for Netanyahu, it's out of the question to even get into a coalition where he would not be prime minister right away. Because only as a prime minister he can get immunity from prosecution. If he's not prime minister and just a minister, but a simple minister, his trial is waiting for him. Is right around the corner, two weeks from now. He was indicted, so he might go to trial.
And how, in Israel, how strong is the case against him considered to be? I mean, I haven't read that much about it.
It's serious enough to have been indicted. So he claims his innocence, and he claims that if he had to go to trial, he will be able to prove his innocence. But he has to go to trial. And unless he's prime minister and he gets some wiggling room to postpone the trial, or maybe to have the parliament vote a law as far as he's concerned, so he won't have to go to trial and to get immunity of some kind. Chances are that he'll go to trial. So the charges are serious enough. That is why you have today the situation. I mean, it's been going on since April of last year. And the issue is not, I mean, you have a government or not a government. You cannot feel it in your daily life, probably, if you live in Israel. However, it is serious because no budget has been voted. No program on social programs or programs on education have been implemented or voted on because there is no money. A caretaker government is just that, taking care of the country, but they cannot adopt there is no Knesset, there is no parliament either, because the parliament was dissolved with the third elections now. So this is a nightmare if that has to go on for any time longer. The security of the country is secured, if I may say, because the army, that's a different thing. But everything else has stopped. Everything else has stopped. It's paralyzed. Yes.
Yeah, Kashmir has been a problem for a long time, but what is India's benefit from Kashmir besides national pride? It doesn't seem to have any strategic benefit.
Not particularly, but it just claimed that it's part of, it was a princely state. It was ruled by a Maharaja back then. So it's, for the Indians, it's part of India. And for Pakistan, it's part of Pakistan because when the partition was made, Pakistan claimed that with a population of 77% Muslim, it should come to Pakistan. So the UN made, as many instances, made both sides unhappy. They partitioned and the British to some extent also. But what was the option? They went to war 4 times over Kashmir. And don't forget, they have atomic nuclear bombs, both of them, today. That's another thing that is monitored very closely. China sided with Pakistan for now. So this is another reason probably but for the longest time, India's best ally in the time of Nehru and Gandhi was Russia, the Soviet Union, I mean. They were very dependent on the Soviet Union for their weapons, and politically speaking, India was very close to the Soviet Union in the 60s, 70s with Nehru and then the Gandhi family. Modi changed all that.
It's just that the map is shown here. Looks like it's much harder for India to defend their borders than it would otherwise be. It now has a huge border to defend compared to what it could otherwise be.
Yeah.
And with hostile forces all around it.
But if you look only from militarily, obviously India has a very large army. I don't know if it's better than the Pakistani army, but it has a very large. Nobody wants to know who's stronger, because this might lead to very unpleasant situation. The thing is that they couldn't find an agreement on how to partition this area. Yes.
Okay, you said the major agreement, the trade agreement between India and the U.S. was not signed. What was that proposed agreement, and why wasn't it signed?
Well, it wasn't signed because basically both sides have the same policy, which is America first and India first. That's why also, ironically, that's why they get along so well, because they understand each other's positions very well.
So why was there a thought that there would be that trade policy signed when Trump went there?
There will be, but for the time, I mean, the Indians do not want to lift a number of tariffs particularly manufactured goods that they make in India nowadays, and they don't want, like the Chinese, they do not want to open their markets, except that India is close to the United States, and it plays a role in the U.S. Presence in the area, because obviously it keeps China's attention, they are neighbors. So China is looking at India as a potential rival economically and also eventually militarily. So this is one way for the United States to counter the influence of China in this whole region.
So the agreement was basically to lower the tariffs that have been.
The agreement would be, to lift the number of.
Not specifically to buy specific products.
No, there are no quotas. They are lifting of tariffs, basically. But since nobody budges, the Americans are not in a mood to do it. But they want access to Indian markets. Well, 1.3 billion people. Even if you discount maybe half of them because they don't have the money, still that's a very large market for American products. But for now, Modi is absolutely, he needs to create 12 million jobs every year just to keep up with the number of young people arriving on the Indian markets on a yearly basis. Because unlike in China, India, their number, the sky's the limit as to the number of children born there. I think I mentioned that to you probably when you talked about India, maybe last year or two, just to give you an example how the minds in India are wired. I was at a UN conference on demographics in Delhi, and I think I mentioned it to you. Anyway, and at the time, the Indian government was running a campaign for fewer children per family. And my hotel was not too far from the convention center where the meetings were taking place, so I was walking to the convention center. And all over Delhi, you had huge billboards put up by officials, by the government, which were divided in two. On one side, you had an Indian family with 5, 6, 7 kids, I don't remember, but a very large family, with a relatively young couple in their 40s, but who looked exhausted, tired, downbeaten, and the kids were not very happy on that picture. And on the other side, you had a young couple with 2 kids, happy, well-dressed, there was no caption or nothing. When you look at something like this, with your Western mind, you go there, you look at it, and you say, obviously, it says what it says. You're happier and you live better with fewer children then. So next to me, as I was stopped, next to me was a Indian couple, and they were speaking English. But as you know, the English is the language that glues together Indian society because they have different languages in different provinces. Obviously, they are not from Delhi because this is the first time they saw this billboard. So they were looking, and I was really next to them. So I overheard they look, and the wife looks at her husband and says to him, pointing at the happy-looking couple, "Look at this couple. What a shame they don't have more children." You know what I said to myself? This is never going to succeed. This policy of. So it's really a question of how you look at these things. It's a shame they don't have more children. That's two ways to look at something, which to you is obvious, and then to someone else is totally different. You had just one question today? Very.
You want more than one?
Yes.
Just want to go back for a second to Israel and their elections. So I understand that this third election might not be successful either, and they might go to a fourth election. Is there a process where this starts and they start being in this limbo?
I don't understand the question.
They're having a third election.
Yes,
today.
yes, that I understood. But what was your question?
My understanding is that this might not succeed, and they're
Absolutely.
already planning for a fourth election.
Well, they haven't planned yet.
Well, but I'm
but
saying that the
that
potential. And my question is there a plan where this stops, and is there a
sky's the limit. That never happened before, as you might know, in Israel's history. Again, because of the special circumstances for these particular elections, where this is the first time also that Netanyahu has a real competitor there in Gantz. There was not the case in previous elections, where this party, Gantz's party, did not even exist. But previously, the Labour Party, which was main opposition party, or it depends. Also, they were running the country for a number of years. Their leaders were not up to Netanyahu's. Netanyahu, besides all his, besides the fact that he's been in power now for 13 years successively, and like everywhere else, after 13 years of seeing the same face as a leader, there is a point where generation, that's one generation, that's enough. Even if he was a very good leader, they want someone else with younger blood, with fresher ideas. Same thing for Merkel in Germany. I don't compare the two, but basically it's the same. There is a fatigue of seeing the same person.
not enough, obviously.
Sorry?
Not enough.
But that depends how you look at it. But that being said,
No, I'm saying it's a third election, obviously not enough.
Netanyahu is a very good politician, and he knew how to stay for such a long time in power. Sometimes going to the left, sometimes going to the right, sometimes relying on the religious government when it was convenient, sometimes he shunned them away for something else. He knows very well the political system. And also, needless to say that for the Israelis, for whom the security issue is the main issue, he didn't take Israel into wars that were not necessary. And he's risk adverse in many ways, but he developed undoubtedly Israel's diplomatic circle in the world. There are many countries with which Israel did not have diplomatic relations, particularly in Africa, with Israel, and which today have embassies there, not in Jerusalem, but in Tel Aviv. So he has done many things for the country. That being said, now people are saying, listen, you holding on to power because you don't want to go to jail, which is understandable also. It's only human. But at the same time, maybe it's time to change. So
Why is it that the United States and the Taliban have recently had these negotiations? Why didn't this happen a year ago or 2 years ago? What has changed that
With the
led-
Taliban, you mean?
Well, the Taliban, the United States, whatever, that has led to having the negotiations now. This has been going on for 18 years. So why didn't this happen a year ago or 2 years ago or 3 years ago?
Well, you're right. Why? I guess because we're getting closer to, because I think the administration also has domestic concerns also. This is one of the promises that Trump made during the campaign, to get out of this, what he called the endless wars from Afghanistan. He was mostly and primarily targeting Afghanistan. And as we're getting closer now to November, he decided that now it's really time to get out of there. Number one. Number two, there are no really other options. You keeping a presence in Afghanistan with 12,000 people or 15,000 people is not enough to win the war. The war is not winnable this way. The war can only be won if you send in 100,000, 200,000, 300,000 troops. Now, needless to say, this is not an option as far as Afghanistan is concerned. Again, the timing, I guess, it's to some extent is linked to November, because then he can claim that he also took America out of its longest war ever. So that's another feather in his orange. Orange. Yes.
Back to Syria for a second, with Russia. What exactly is Russia trying to accomplish in Syria? I mean, is this something, is it personal feat for them? Is it the idea of prestige for the nation? Represent, like, hey, we're back as world players again? Do they think they can have some financial benefit from that? Because the Russian economy, it's slightly above Cedar Grove, it's slightly below Montclair. If you get my drift, they really don't have the economy to go out and fight proxy wars all over the globe. And in Syria, it's not like things are going to straighten out next year. It's a disaster for 10 years, it's a disaster now, and maybe a disaster 10 years from now. What exactly do you think you're helping to accomplish?
But I think when you looked at Syria, the main incentive for Russia to be there is a presence in the Middle East. And that's the only country in the Middle East where they still have a presence. They were kicked out of Syria when the Soviet Union broke up. They were kicked out of Egypt. Egypt was their main ally in the Middle East. Remember Nasser in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And they lost influence completely in the Middle East. So Syria gave them the opportunity, and the fact that the Americans pulled out of Syria altogether, he filled a vacuum left by the Americans, and today Syria became Russia's major strategic asset in the Middle East. It can control a little bit what's going on in Iran also, and it has a naval base which is very important to the Russians on the Mediterranean, in Taurus, the port of Taurus. So you're absolutely right. Syria is a disaster economically from every point of view, but and Russia does not have the means to reconstruct Syria tomorrow, nor does anybody else actually. How the Syrians are going to reconstruct, it remains to be seen, because all the actors involved, they just shrug their shoulders and say, well, it's not our doing, it was civil war, forgetting that they contributed to some extent to the damage done in Syria. But nobody has the faintest idea how Syria will be reconstructed and by whom. But in the meantime, the Russians, for the Russians, it's fair, but they have a presence in the Middle East. And as I also mentioned, it seems to me, when he spoke about Syria, is that the Russians are not particularly attached to the persona of Bashar al-Assad. They won't care if Bashar al-Assad is overthrown tomorrow, as far as they have a government in Damascus which is friendly to them. They, unlike the Iranians, who'd like very much Bashar al-Assad to stay in power because he represents in many ways a leader who's closest to Iran personally also. The Russians do not care if Bashar al-Assad is there tomorrow. Again, as long as, and that was their justification, if you will, why they intervened in Syria in the first place. They told the Americans from the beginning, you want to change you don't want, because the US, when it got involved diplomatically anyway, the main condition, if you remember, for the US, even before opening negotiations with Damascus, was for Bashar al-Assad to leave and to let the Syrians have a different leader, because Bashar al-Assad, they say, is too compromised to stay in power. And the Russians at the time told the Americans, listen, we are not particularly attached to Bashar al-Assad. You want to get rid of him, that's fine. What we do want, though, is to have a friendly government in Damascus. And they also said to the Americans, let's say that you overthrow his government tomorrow. Do you know what's going to come in its place? Maybe it's ISIS, because at the time ISIS occupied part of Syria. And if that's the case, you're worse off than before, at least with Bashar al-Assad, like with Saddam Hussein, if you knew what you got. It wasn't great, but you knew what you got. If you overthrow Bashar al-Assad like you did with Saddam Hussein, like you did with Gaddafi, look at Libya, look at Iraq today. You want the same thing in Syria? And it can even be worse, because ISIS is even stronger than it used to be at that time. So do you want an ISIS government in Damascus? No. So might as well, keep him. And in a way, that was also the line of thinking of the American administration, is that why should we get involved? After all, after a while, when they saw that Bashar al-Assad is not going anywhere, said, might as well let him, what difference does it make if we have a different government in Syria? We know never going to have a so-called democratic government over there, because when Bashar al-Assad came to power, when his father died, and he came to power, he was not the one who was supposed to take over from his father. His older brother was supposed to take over. And he was groomed in Syria to take. Bashar al-Assad is a dentist. And he lived in London. He was out of the country. He was not involved at all in the Syrian politics. He was not interested particularly in Syrian politics. He married a Lebanese lady, and he lived happily in London as a dentist. That was his background. And his father groomed his older son, his brother, Um, he was a general in the army, and he was supposed to take over eventually. Hafez al-Assad, the father, died relatively young, and it was a sudden death. But he was supposed to take over, and I think his son had a car accident or something, and he died. And that's when Hafez al-Assad brought back Bashir from London to take over. He had absolutely no background in military or any other way to take over Syria. But he got into it. I mean, he kept his father's advisors, and he basically practiced the same policies in Syria as his father. So the Americans said, well, let's keep him. But for the Russians, it's very important. Now they have a naval base, which they used to have before when it was the Soviet Union, and from which they were kicked out. And we have a naval base in the Mediterranean, and we have a military presence, permanent presence now in Syria, which is very important to us to control a little bit what's going on in the Middle East. And also to contain Israel to some extent from Syria. That's the Russia's main reason why they intervened at all in Syria. But now Putin wants to get out. He's been there for the past 4 years, and it's getting expensive, and it's very unpopular in Russia also. The Russian, the public opinion says enough is enough. We went in there to help the Syrians. Now, for all intents and purposes, Syria, or the government in Damascus, retook control of the entirety of Syria. It's time for the Russians to come home, except for the troops that they'll be leaving behind. But it's time to bring home our boys. That's what it is. All right. More? Yes. Sorry.
It was a question about India. You discussed what's happening, the anti-Muslim movement that was going on, but India has a very large Muslim population that's been there from the beginning of partition. And so are they, aside from being under attack in a way, is there any laws that are being changed to change the status of the Muslims that are
the existing
population?
No. They are not absolutely. The Modi mentioned that several times when he presented these two laws in the Indian Parliament, that the existing the Muslim population already in India has nothing to fear. No. That being said, there are always riots.
Oh, I know, yeah. One thing, though, when I was in India in the 70s, when Indira Gandhi was there,
yes,
they had a big program for sterilization of men. They did vasectomies in the train stations. They would have areas set up, and this was really encouraged.
Well, there are in the train stations in Canada, you have machines selling condoms. So why not sterilization programs in train stations? Yeah.
Can't get it from a machine.
Yeah, but they are not mandatory, I think.
No, it wasn't mandatory.
But that's a difference between China and India. For India, every family, I remember anyway, at some point, they had a program, and every family who committed itself somehow to have 2 children or less, in the rural areas mostly, received a radio transistor, like they used to make them at the time. While China imposed extreme measures on families. I mean, they lost their apartments when they lived in Beijing or in a large city in China. They were sent to the countryside, and there were serious consequences. As a third child or the fourth child could not go to school, there was very serious consequences when this mandatory program went into effect in China.
But India saw itself as a democracy.
India is the largest democracy in the world. Anyway, that's how India is called. I don't know how democratic it is, but it's the largest. Definitely, it's large. All right. Well, thank you very much. I'll see you next week. So the coronavirus, our last hooray for the winter. Yes.
I don't know who takes the last meeting of the next week. I think is